Greetings, classicists, and bit of special effects there, and welcome to our next and maybe one of the final videos for Classiv this year. So this is on the Persian reality segment, and of course the reign of Darius, or elements of the reign of Darius. So let's get going. So one thing that's a very important thing to understand about Darius, and the source we do have is from Herodotus, but I think we can see that it's almost certainly true as reflected in the Persian reality materials, if you like, is the way that Darius becomes king. So Darius is technically, sorry, the puppy's trying to join in the lesson. Darius is technically a usurper, so he is not next in line to the throne. And what seems to have happened is that Darius and 7 conspirators agreed to remove the true heir to the throne, who was called Smerdis or Bardia, depending on which versions you look at. Now, there's obviously a bit of debate about this because, according to Darius, the propaganda Darius tries to spread around, this is an imposter. It's a magi who has taken has taken on a false identity of the son of the previous king, Cambyses. And so what Darius is doing is restoring order and peace and justice, if you like, to the line of succession. He himself was not the next in line, but there wasn't anyone. So it certainly shouldn't be going to those awful magi, the priestly class. So there is a lot about this in Herodotus, but just have a look at Herodotus 369 and then 377 to 79, and again just jot down a few ideas about well, a good place to start and think about again is the difference between Greeks and Persians, because even though this isn't a set passage by any means, it's got again some good stuff about Persian politics and the way it all works according to Herodotus, and thus the Greek perspective. But it's an exciting story nonetheless. So anyway, important to remember that Darius is not the legitimate heir to the Persian throne, and this does, in some senses, haunt the early part of his reign. So we can see where things are on this family tree. So you'll notice that all of these Persian kings go back to a legendary ancestor called Achaemenes, and that's why they're called the Achaemenid dynasty. So if you see the phrase the Achaemenids or the Achaemenid dynasty, that is referring to Cyrus and Darius and the Persian kings as we understand them, and they go back to this mythical ancestor. So Darius does have some connection in theory back to Achaemenes, but he's not a direct descendant by any means. So if you look at Cyrus II in 550 to 530, you'll see he has 2 sons, Cambyses II and Bardia. Cambyses takes over but dies, and then Bardia, who is supposed to be next in line, is, well, depends on who you believe, either killed by the Magi and replaced by one of their own, and Darius steps in to heroically restore order to the empire, or Darius assassinates the rightful son of Cyrus the Great and steals the empire, depends on which one you believe. And Darius's claim is pretty dubious, but it goes back to, as you can see here, his great-grandfather, would that be? Or great-great-grandfather was Tiespes, who was a Persian king who I've never heard of. But anyway, there is a sort of vague connection of Darius to the Achaemenid royal family, but it's pretty tenuous. So the big issue here is, of course, Darius's legitimacy, and it is something that he has to deal with in a variety of ways. So what it would seem is that on Darius's accession, there were many early revolts. And the reason for this is probably many. I'm sure there would be some who didn't feel that he was the legitimate emperor. So, dog's barking at the cat. Didn't feel he was the legitimate emperor, so they were rebelling against his usurpation of the throne. But I suspect many others were just subject people of the Persian. Subject people of the Persian Empire who were looking to regain their freedom. Remember, places like Babylon have been proud, independent kingdoms for hundreds of years. The same with Egypt, thousands of years. So none of these necessarily, or significant elements of these kingdoms don't want to stay under Persian rule. So they break out into revolt, and one by one Darius crushes them, because whilst the empire may not be particularly loyal, Darius does have a very well trained, very loyal army, and he travels around the Persian Empire, reconquering these rebellious provinces. So I've done this backwards really, but the impact on Persian art of Darius' accession to the throne is this constant quest for legitimacy. So Darius being depicted as the rightful ruler, the chosen of Ahura Mazda, because then you can't argue with Ahura Mazda. He is the god. So if the god says, well, Darius is the rightful king, then you'll absolutely see that. So there's this constant reinforcement of Darius's legitimacy and Darius's strength and power to discourage revolts. So Darius as a king had a number of innovations that were extremely important for the Persian Empire. So the first thing he did, the first thing we're going to talk about, is his administrative innovations. So he split the empire up into 20 satrapies, and these are basically provinces, and the head of each province, satrapy, is a satrap. Now, these satraps were often especially loyal to Darius and the Persian kings. Where possible, they were usually members of the royal family. Sometimes, slightly extended members, cousins, people like that. They could have been very loyal generals, but either way, they normally have a very strong connection to the royal family. So you've got your provincial governor, your satrap. Now, each satrap does have a separate secretary appointed by the Persian emperor to keep an eye on him. So, it's not uncommon for family to revolt against family. So there was another official there whose job, in part, was to monitor the satrap for disloyalty to the great king. And each satrapy also has a treasurer who's responsible for raising and assessing taxes. And each satrapy has a fixed amount of tribute that it has to provide. So quite a kind of complex, well-regulated financial tax-raising system. So that means that the great king has a reasonable amount of money at his disposal. What else did Darius do with regard to economy and trade? Well, he did something pretty revolutionary in a sense, in that he introduced universal currency. So the whole empire uses the same currency. So the golden daric for very high value stuff, and the silver daric if it's a little bit less. So that is a bit of a kind of financial revolution. So your golden daric you can spend in Egypt, you can spend in Bactria, you can spend in Persia. So bringing a kind of universal currency is quite a powerful thing in terms of trade, stimulating trade and the economy, and we see that today with the EU and the euro. Now, this also led to a kind of development of some quite sophisticated, for the time, financial services. So you started to see the growth of banking firms. So we've got some clay tablets, which are the records of a banking firm called Murashu and Sons. So we're looking at quite a sophisticated imperial financial system. And again, it can be a little bit complicated to hold in our heads sometimes, this idea of these nomadic Persian kings riding around from place to place, and yet also putting in place these complicated, seemingly very sedentary financial systems. In order to stimulate trade and economy, Darius also built the system of royal roads and the postal system that Herodotus says is the most, the fastest sort of that mortal men and information can move. So this is again, requires organisation. It requires discipline. It requires, quite a strong sense of imperial control. And obviously, the roads and these things are built for Persian armies and Persian messengers, but they will also be used by merchants, other people, and this really would have stimulated trade and the economy. In terms of stimulating trade and the economy, Darius also has a huge program of building canals and irrigation to improve agriculture in some dry and inhospitable areas, and as a result, again, improve trade and surplus. So he was had a very sort of sensible economic mind. Now, in terms of religion, Darius was firmly Zoroastrian, and that means, of course, his focus on the truth and the lie and the light and the dark, and viewing things perhaps in quite a religious sense, and certainly attaching himself to Ahura Mazda for legitimacy. However, Darius did support submissive other religions in the places that he conquered. So he didn't, when he conquered or regained control of Babylon and Egypt, he didn't destroy the temples and try and implement the rule of Ahura Mazda. He allowed subject peoples of the Persian Empire to practice their own religion, which is normally a very good idea because it stops revolts. People will tolerate a reasonable amount in certain areas, but often religion, maybe not so much now, but in the past, religion would be one thing that would make people constantly rebel against you and fight to the death. Thank you, Meme. So Darius not only allowed other religions, but in certain cases funded them. So, for example, Cyrus had promised to rebuild the temple of the Israelites, the Temple of Solomon, and it hadn't been finished, and Darius contributed to the funding and ensured that that promise made by Cyrus was kept. So, in terms of how the Persian Empire is run, there is this idea of Ahura Mazda as the principal deity, but tolerating other religions and even supporting them for sort of purposes of unity is very much the strategy and tactic of a great king, a Persian emperor, at least up until Xerxes, perhaps. So in terms of building projects, he created a canal that joined the Red Sea to the Nile. So again, trade routes, but also something to think about. Again, it's a very large geoengineering project, if you like, and that is something that Persian emperors do seem to have, or Persian kings rather, do seem to have done a reasonable amount of. And according to some scholars, there's actually a little bit of symbolism going on here. So controlling the natural world is not such a bad thing for Persian emperors. It's not considered to be hubris. It's considered to be bringing order to chaos. And we'll look at that a little bit later on in more detail when we look at Xerxes, and obviously his bridging of the Hellespont and his digging of the canal at Mount Athos. So there are hints that there was a very different Persian perspective to this. Now, even though he'd obviously put down the Egyptian revolt when they revolted against him, he contributed funds to rebuilding programs. So he built a temple to the Egyptian god Amun. So again, we're seeing this kind of control through tolerance and an encouragement of religious practices that don't directly challenge the Persians. Now, he is also famous for building a huge palace at Susa, one of the Persian capitals, and we'll have a look at little parts of that later on. So, building this huge palace is probably drifting more back into this, stereotypes idea. To what extent were the Greeks accurate in their stereotypical depictions of Persians? And building a huge palace is, in a sense, the epitome of wealth, luxury, and kind of individual dominance. Remember, especially from an Athenian perspective, there would have been all sorts of rich villas and so on and so forth, but there certainly wouldn't have been this central building that would remind you of the rule of a single individual, and that certainly wouldn't have happened at Sparta. There were no huge palaces for Spartan kings, so we are looking at some truth, in a sense, if you like, to a tyrannical, dominant system in Persia. So what I would like to do now is have a look at another Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones video, and this is the one on Darius. So again, just a quick 6 minutes, again, jotting down some of the key ideas, key arguments, etc. I'll put the link up in the Teams assignment. So the next thing that we are going to look at is a really important piece of visual material. So this is visual material that can appear in the exam, and this to me seems a really likely one to come up because there's a lot there to analyse. Some of the other Persian stuff, I don't know whether you can analyse it in enough depth to write a 10 marker. Now, well, they'll almost certainly prove me wrong by doing it, but this one to me seems like a really, really good kind of go-to piece of imagery with so much in it. And this is called the Bistun relief. And what I would like to do, you've got your handout with a picture of the Bistun on it, and there is an article of analysis to go with it by a guy called Wieshofer, who is a sort of leading authority on Persian artifacts and scholarship and so on and so forth. So what I'd like you to do is to read Wieshofer and use that to annotate the picture. What's going on? Who's Darius in the image? What's Darius doing? What's significant about Darius? Who's he standing on? Why are there 7 people with ropes around their neck? So analyze what's going on in the picture by reading Wieshofer. And then as you're reading through Wieshofer, I'd also like to pick out 3 broad academic arguments about either Bistun or Darius or the Persians. Then, as always with this element of the course, highlight some areas that correspond to Greek stereotypes of Persians. And I think there's going to be a fair bit there. And again, do it properly. So highlight, maybe with a different colour, write a sentence or some notes. Why does this particular element correspond to Greek stereotypes of Persians? You've got, if you want to sort of a freebie, for example, you've got the great king enslaving people from 7 different nations with the yokes and chains of slavery around their neck. So if ever there was a Greek stereotype of these Persians who are desperate to enslave and conquer the world, it's kind of summed up in the Bistun image. Now, obviously, Darius's response, as you'll see, is that they're traitors and they're being brought back into the brought back to the path of truth and light, having betrayed and lied. So the Greeks wouldn't have been very, very keen on that. If you betray an oath, that's a heinous crime, as Jason discovers in Medea. Anyway, that's the kind of thing you need to be looking for. So this is a big task. This will be 20 minutes at least, I would have thought, if done properly. Lovely. So what else happened in Darius's reign? So obviously we're drifting now into Herodotus, and Herodotus is a very significant source, but I think it's worth just looking at Darius from this perspective once more. So what did Darius do during the Ionian revolt in terms of sort of managing as a great king? Well, one of the things that he was very good at was using old oligarchs, so people from these Greek cities that had revolted. He had this kind of network of spies, these individuals who used to rule these cities, who he paid and kept and sort of encouraged them to go and inform on what was going on in these cities. So he had a sort of spy network built up of old rulers, and he was always trying to get them back in power. And this spy network actually wanders around the army of the Greeks before the Battle of Lade and starts to sow dissension in the ranks. Promise people that Darius won't harm their city if they betray the Greeks, and promise them wealth and positions of power and so on and so forth. So he's got an effective devious spy network, and he in response to the Ionian revolt, he assembles a huge army and navy which he uses to crush the rebels. So the army is made up of all sorts of subject Persian peoples, largely Phoenicians and Egyptians, who are much better sailors than Persians, and then the army is made up of again Persians, but Medes and Lydians. So the Greeks are crushed in a sort of naval sense and in a financial sense due to superior Persian organisation and tactics and size and scale. Now, one of the things that Darius does to ensure that these cities don't revolt is make an example of them. So he sacks the cities, he enslaves the women, and he castrates the men. And he does this most notably at Miletus, which was one of the greatest Greek cities in the world at this point, and it is absolutely obliterated. It's turned to nothing. It almost never really reappears again. So again, in terms of stereotypes of Persians, we are seeing some pretty stereotypical behaviour here. Tyrannical dominance, genocide almost of a people. So the next thing that Darius does that again is worth reminding ourselves of is Darius and the Marathon campaign. Now Darius doesn't go on this campaign himself. He sends one of his brothers and another Mede, so that's Datis and Artaphernes. Now they've been sent to crush Athens and the smaller city of Eretria, who provided ships for the Ionian revolt. Now the city of Eretria is attacked first, and again we see a classic kind of Persian tactic. Oligarchs are bribed and they open the doors to the Persian soldiers with the understanding that they'll be put in charge of running the city once the Persians have finished with it. And maybe that does happen, but there's not much left to rule because the city is sacked, and again many of the Eritrean Greeks are enslaved and sold off as punishment for revolting against, well, not for revolting against Darius, but for encouraging revolt within the empire. Now he then goes on and we get the whole story of Marathon, or rather the Datis and Artaphernes go on and we get the story of the defeat at Marathon, where even though they're trying, they're led by again an Athenian oligarch who is betraying Athens and Greece, they are defeated by the Athenian army under Miltiades. So we're not going to go over that story again. Now what we've got here is again another Vismat task. So what I would like you to do is read the attached article and annotate this image. So again, what's the significance of all of these things, and then in another colour, again, how does this correspond or challenge Greek stereotypes of Persian rulers? So there we go. That is today's lesson, and I will catch you for the next one.